Hello, everyone. I'm Amy LaValle, and welcome to the Brian Grant Foundation monthly webcast. People with Parkinson's often experience social isolation, depression, and anxiety. This loneliness is associated with worsening of Parkinson's symptoms, but social prescribing and social connections might just be the prescription for this. Dr. Subramanian will help us understand the science behind how vital social interaction is for improving mood, reducing feelings of loneliness, and enhancing the overall quality of life for individuals with Parkinson's. Dr. Indu Subramanian is board certified in integrative medicine. She's a clinical professor of neurology at UCLA and is passionate about studying palliative care and the effects of loneliness on people living with Parkinson's. Before I hand this over to our guest, I'd like to invite you to put your questions into the chat box below, and we'll do our best to get to them. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Subramanian. I'd like to hand this over to you for your great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Always lovely to see you guys at the Brian Grant Foundation. You guys are doing great things. So maybe I'll just go ahead and share my slides here, and we'll take it from there. So I think that, when we talk about Parkinson's disease, we have been historically, talking about it as a motor disease. We teach our students around these images of people with motor disability, and something that may strike you when you look at these pictures is they are largely of Caucasian individuals and largely of men. And so we brand this disease as a motor disease, classically with stiffness, slowness, and tremor. Later with some balance issues. And, I think this is still an image that comes to mind when we're talking about Parkinson's, though that doesn't fit so many of our people living with Parkinson's across the world. The motor disease is largely what we, again, focus on, even in clinics. I'm a movement disorder neurologist, but the mental health burden and the non-motor burden is huge and profound, and really what affects quality of life. And I think, we, with the COVID-19 pandemic, really saw sort of a sense of how mental health can affect all of us, and really thinking about gaps in care. I think mental health is a hugely under addressed issue in Parkinson's. And I think we have, this pandemic of Parkinson's where we have many more cases. In the last 40 years, there's been a doubling. In the next 20 years, another doubling of Parkinson's. And so we just have so many cases and so many people that are not being served, a lack of resources, and especially in the mental health universe, really a scarcity of mental health resources, a huge sort of lack of disease awareness. Many people just focus on the motor aspects, really some disparate sort of care being given to a select few, really, and a lot of people not being served well with the current model where people are coming in, have to complain about a neurologic symptom. I treat that symptom and then send them back out, come back in 6 months, maybe tweak a pill, and really not addressing the larger sort of issues of sort of what we're dealing with in the post-pandemic or peri-pandemic sort of timeframe of people having been really socially distanced and isolated, really the sort of burnout of caregivers, and really, I think, addressing head-on the sort of identification that Parkinson's is a hugely stigmatizing disease, and so really thinking about that. And so we wrote this paper on giving the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. And I think a lot of folks had felt like, that day that they heard the words, "you have Parkinson's," was like a bomb sort of blew up in their lives and really changed the trajectory of how they would live moving forward. And really not a lot of attention being paid to how that sort of delivery of the message was being given. There wasn't good support, not a lot of time, not a lot of sort of catering to a message of hope and, wellness, what types of proactive things people could do. And people really feel, I think, that, it is something that we could do better at as the healthcare community. And so we wrote this paper thinking about how to do better, maybe perhaps giving a focus on social support from the get-go and having people come in those early visits with somebody who can, help cheerlead for them. And so you're going to be hearing sort of the importance of social support as part of the prescription throughout some of the next several slides, and really thinking about, who are we serving, how to serve them better, giving them vetted resources, giving them accurate information, helping to empower the person so that they can then feel like they can live better every day, and really normalizing the sense that there is a grief reaction, a change, and a number of sort of reactions that people feel when they're given a diagnosis, and providing space and time for people to process this and adequate social support. So you may remember back to perhaps that day of diagnosis and all the things you might have felt. What's my future look like? I really feel like I don't have control over it. I'm feeling demoralized. I'm feeling, denial. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling ashamed. I'm feeling fearful. All of these things are emotions that are, some of the patient voices that helped to write this paper sort of had voiced. And I think that, really confronting the fact that Parkinson's is a very stigmatizing disease. People feel othered when they get this diagnosis, and that they don't fit into sort of the broader societal sort of network. And then sort of what are those consequences? And in learning about stigma, and we wrote about this with some patient voices as well, we really had this sort of sense that, yes, the public can look at Parkinson's patients and treat them differently and othered, but that there's also this felt sense of stigma where the person living with the disease themselves puts certain shame and sort of blame on themselves, and has a sense that the public is sort of feeling a certain way, but really that person is then sort of reflecting what they feel the public is feeling about them on themselves, thus leading to often isolation and feeling socially disconnected, feeling alone, feeling, sort of anxious and depressed, and really demoralized. And really the sense that sometimes even people conceal their diagnosis. They may not access the healthcare system, and really may disconnect even from getting help, in the standard ways. So really thinking about how can we change this trajectory, and really thinking about how we can do better from the get-go, giving a message of at diagnosis of hope and compassion, plugging people into social networks where they can get the support they need, and avoiding this sort of derailment with then kind of becoming socially isolated and kind of almost going into hiding after they're given this sort of information. So some things to think about. And why do we care about stigma? Stigma really can affect mental health. It can affect physical health. It can change a number of things like self-esteem and self-efficacy, and it can actually then lead to increased social isolation. And so, in talking about this and how it affects people with Parkinson's, 50% of people with Parkinson's actually conceal their diagnosis. They report stigma. They feel that there's sort of, a sense that they are classified as being sick, as well as in a group of folks in this ageism and ableist sort of society where they are clubbed into, this old men's sort of club of folks that are sick. And so really, feel often that there's a lot of mythology around, what they're dealing with. And in parts of the world, like Africa, this is borne out where people think that, Parkinson's is contagious, that there's some witchcraft that's affected the person living with it. And so really, being able to dispel these myths and normalize, the feelings of feeling othered from the get-go, and really sort of leaning into that social support rather than, sort of straying away from it. So I work at the VA. There's this sort of concept of whole health where we have the patient in the middle and a number of lifestyle choices around, and really the sense that people living with Parkinson's can, hopefully think about this model. And we actually made the model a little bit bespoke for people living with Parkinson's, and thinking about these sort of buckets of lifestyle choices and how we can help people to live better. So one thing that's important to note is that, with Parkinson's, it's not just about the tremor or the stiffness, the slowness, as we mentioned, but that you're living in a body that can have brittle bones, that can have poor vision, that can have poor hearing, and all of these things can actually lead to a worse trajectory should you fall. We actually realize that, bad hearing and bad vision can lead to dementia as people age. Poor dental health can actually lead to bad outcomes. And so thinking about you in the context of all of these sorts of things in your general health, but also thinking about, what are the types of things in a lifestyle that you can drizzle in daily to sort of live better with Parkinson's, this wellness framework. And so things like exercise, in the Brian Grant Foundation, I think exercise is known as a form of medicine. And I certainly drink that Kool-Aid. Diet and nutrition is important. Getting good sleep is important. The mind-body approaches, which I've spent some time learning about, things like yoga, mindfulness, getting out in nature. These are all part of the medicine, but also social connection and really thinking about, how to continue to connect with family and friends and stay in your community in a vital way is actually part of the medicine. So when we think about wellness, we think about the cultural context, and I think it's important not to just make this universally the same for everyone, which is what we've largely done before, but really think about, this slide, for example, in the First Nations, for them, wellness and health really has to do with the land, their tribe, their tribal leaders, some of the spiritual connection that they have to that, as well as the other tribes. And so really thinking about, what matters to you as a person, what means the most for your values and beliefs and your customs, what are the types of things that you think, when you think about, why did you get sick? What is health and how do we make you better? Are there things that you believe in, perhaps from your cultural context, that's important for your healthcare providers to know? Who may be in that sort of healing circle for you? Is it a faith or community leader? Is it your yoga teacher? So really thinking about, the cultural context, understanding, maybe where you live, the sort of barriers you may have to accessing things. Is there a language barrier? Is there, other barriers, that are affecting how you're able to interact with the healthcare system, and really catering in a bespoke way our care to you. And so when we ask people living with Parkinson's, and this is a beautiful paper written by Andrew Jack and Malthor about what people with Parkinson's disease want, it really falls into some of these categories. And I think you'll notice the theme here. So one is that they want access to their healthcare team. They want access to a movement disorder specialist. They want ideas about self-care and education about, what are the best things I should be doing in my lifestyle, like diet and exercise and these other approaches. But they also want support, and they want support not just for themselves, but also for their families. They want peer-to-peer support as well to be able to connect with other people living with Parkinson's disease. And so I think that these are all things that we need to really think about when considering how to improve quality of life. And really being bespoke about it. So, we wrote a paper about, for example, protein and understanding, who the person is. And I think we've been trying to change the images of Parkinson's to not just those of those older white men, really thinking about, the women, for example, who are not, having a seat at the table historically in both research or in good clinical care. Where are the gaps here? And so I think if you fall into a category that's historically, minority, be that a person of color or geography or, even gender. So women, I think, have specific, unique needs. And actually, they often have, from a psychosocial perspective, a much better time connecting with other women. And so women-only support groups, helping women to find women in their lives to kind of cheerlead for them is actually part of the medicine. And I think, one thing that I will just stress here is that women often find that they feel worse about themselves from a psychological perspective. Their self-image can be very negative, especially if they're unable to fulfill roles as caregivers. If they can be, a parent to a child, help their husband or help their mother-in-law, they're often usually willing to do that first than to take care of themselves. So they really need encouragement to sort of get out there and not be isolated socially, and to really connect with others. So I think this is important to really think about these bespoke kind of ways to cater some of this conversation. I'm actually going to skip through a couple of these slides just in the interest of time. So I mentioned the mind-body approaches and this being something that could be part of the medicine. And I just want to spend a minute talking about this. So I've done some yoga training and mindfulness training, and I've learned actually how to teach this. And I find that this is actually something that could be very accessible to some of our people living with Parkinson's. But I think many of us have talked about, go learn how to meditate for 20 minutes a day, sit on a yoga mat. And many people find this very inaccessible. So if there's ways that we can actually, sort of make things that you may already be doing in your life, perhaps getting out in nature, spending time in your garden, spending time, in the trees in the forest, thinking about perhaps prayer as a form of sort of stillness, and connecting to something that's higher. These are things that may be more available to you than the classic ways, and even getting involved in things like singing, dancing, playing music and art. And if you can do all of these sorts of things with another person, it makes it all the more enjoyable. And actually you get, some brownie points for the mind-body approach as well as the social connection piece. So I think, thinking about as we're going through the slide deck, what speaks to you, maybe taking away, yes, I love being in nature. Let me, put something on the calendar to connect with my, best friend from high school and go on a hike. I mean, I think these are sorts of the practical things that I'd love to sort of take away. And I spent a year at the New York Zen Center, learning about contemplative medicine and how to approach this. And so we've sort of been trying to put some of these things in practice. So now pivoting a little bit from that wellness framework to, the meat of what we're talking about here, which is really about social connection. So in the pre-pandemic timeframe, we had done some surveys. Lori Mischley, who's up there in the Pacific Northwest with you guys, and I, along with Josh Faranick, had looked at a data set of what was then called the PD study, has since become the modifiable variables in Parkinson's, the MVP study. And basically, this was a study looking at, are there variables that people live with every day that we can modify to help people live better? And what does that look like in terms of their Parkinson's outcomes, quality of life, and measures like that? So we looked at loneliness in this data set, and this is Lori and I. And so just to give you some background, so social isolation is actually very, harmful, I think, in general to health. In general, populations, being socially isolated is worse than smoking a half pack of cigarettes a day or being obese. And this is pre-pandemic data. So it does increase mortality and is associated with a number of health outcomes that are not good. So things like strokes and cancer and heart disease and things like that. In veterans, actually causes things like depression, anxiety, suicide, and substance abuse. And in elderly populations and in general, loneliness actually puts us at a higher increased risk of getting things like Alzheimer's disease as well as Parkinson's disease in most recent data sets. So being socially connected, having social connection is a basic human need, just like food, water, and shelter. And I think we really saw some of these sort of things play out during the pandemic. So we've used the word social isolation, and we've also used the word loneliness here in my talk. So what social isolation is basically something that we can actually measure. So I can know, for example, in your life, Mr. Smith, he lives in a house with 3 other people. He goes to the grocery store and interacts with these people. He goes to the coffee shop and talks to this person and interacts with this neighbor on a daily basis and talks on the phone to these 3 people every day. I can measure these different interactions and networks. What loneliness is actually a very subjective thing. It's this undesirable, subjective emotional state in which there's a perception of social isolation. So there's this gap between sort of feeling that I want certain types of qualities of relationships and what I have. So what I desire is a relationship and what I have, that gap really is that felt sense of feeling lonely. And so it's really this sort of subjective thing. And in doing this sort of research, we looked at a number of articles and stuff, and I was really struck by some of these facts. So in order to not feel lonely, you actually need to cultivate connections in 3 spheres. So one is this intimate sphere where you have maybe a close confidant or your spouse at home, a relational sphere where you have close friendships with folks outside of your home, and then a collective connection where you have a network of folks in your community of people who share your sense of purpose and interest. And so in these three spheres, I think we want to be cultivating connections. And in that sort of sense, I was looking at folks on, these virtual visits and seeing that my patient was cared for by their beautiful wife and seemed to be very connected. And I assumed that couple was good to go in terms of their loneliness measures. But in fact, that loneliness, that happily married couple can actually, in fact, be lonely together because they're missing these other spheres of connection. So loneliness also affects physiology in the body. It can increase stress hormones. It changes your immune function so that people can't fight disease as well. It changes cognition. People get more hypervigilant. They tend to fixate on more socially threatening stimuli, and it can affect sleep. Actually, it can disrupt sleep and mess up circadian rhythm. So I mentioned this study that we did, and we had surveyed about 1,700 patients with Parkinson's disease and looked at a number of things. And what we saw was quite striking, that loneliness, so that if you answered positive to I am lonely, it was actually pretty profoundly but impactful on quality of life. And I have a lot of friends was actually very beneficial for quality of life. And that was compared to something that's as obvious that we usually fixate on, like tremor, which actually doesn't affect quality of life so much at all. And in looking at the data set, we found that in terms of severity of Parkinson's disease, the negative effects of loneliness were as bad for you as the positive effects of exercising 7 days a week for 30 minutes a day was good for you. So really a very profound, highly impactful signal that we're seeing here. And we found this in the pre-pandemic timeframe. And so when we went into the pandemic and we were seeing that people were socially, sheltering in place and that they weren't exercising as much as they were before and really, staying away from group contact, we were really worried about sort of what that meant for our patients. And if you look at this, what I call the maple leaf diagram, I'm Canadian, so I love maple leaves. And so, I don't know how well this translates for you all, but if you look at this line, this is the lonely line. And really where loneliness is impactful is across the board with symptoms, but really the non-motor symptoms, things like depression, anxiety, fatigue, apathy, things like that are really where we're seeing a larger signal in the lonely population compared to not lonely. So going into the pandemic, we really had this worry, we had this increased risk of PD cases globally, this loneliness pandemic that was already happening, and then enter COVID-19 and its effects. And I think sometime in the pandemic, there was this pretty early on, this cartoon that Bas Blom and his group created, where we had social isolation, stress, and physical inactivity affecting Parkinson's patients with this potential downward spiral. And really, what were the saviors of the day were really things that I had been sort of cheerleading for all along, things like socializing, mind-body approaches, getting exercise. So I think we are, recovering from this time frame, but I think many of the issues and the aftermath still continue. So we did this sort of look at how did social isolation affect mood across the global sort of network of folks. And really, in large numbers, for example, this group of 5,000 folks, there was an increase in apathy, anxiety, depression, fatigue, sleep, and cognition in this cohort in the US. So across the world, we were seeing, worsening of these sort of mental health burden given the sort of social distancing. So really the sense that we had this potential downward spiral with social isolation affecting a number of parameters in the body, stress hormones, cortisol, and immune effects, disrupting circadian rhythm with sleep, and then affecting those motor as well as especially non-motor Parkinson's symptoms, leading to more apathy, anxiety, and depression. then leading to less interest in going out and connecting, and really more interest in being isolated. And this real worry that we were in this downward spiral. So we proposed actually in 2020 the concept of social prescribing as something that might be a savior of the day. And just to clarify what social prescribing is, it's literally my ability as a clinician to identify people who might be at risk for loneliness, and then to plug them in with some folks, like a link worker, for example, in the national health system in the UK. There are these folks, they're called link workers here, maybe a social worker or a support group leader, to figure out what the sort of armamentarium in the community of social connection may be. And these are some things that were described in a New England Journal of Medicine article, things like art-based therapies, gyms, community activities, gardening, cooking, sports, things like that, nutrition intervention. So it's really kind of getting folks together in their communities. And just as a doctor's prescription can only improve health if the patient has access to a well-stocked pharmacy, so social prescribing schemes depend on a well-stocked community. So really bringing healthcare back to the community where I think it really does belong. It's not meant to be practiced, 3 hours from where you live, but really I view health and wellness as a daily sort of, activity of trying to pick lifestyle choices that are healthy for you, and not just, passively receiving a pill or a surgery, in these sort of episodic visits to a doctor. So, this is an example of a social prescribing network in the northwest of England, the National Health System. So sports clubs and community groups and religious groups and things. And so literally this link worker can help, sort of find out what's available in the community and then help plug people in, just like some of the folks at the Brian Grant Foundation might be able to plug some of you in with certain interests. And so I think, thinking about how to do this in our own community is something that we have to really brainstorm about. The VA had a model of this and has a model of this where through a referral from a clinician, folks are being matched to volunteers who call them once a week to check in on them, and sort of they're matched through some survey questions to people who might be, sort of in the same branch of the military or some other sort of interests that they may share. And so we talked about this in a New York Times article, and I was quoted as saying, I think it's the way of the future. Social prescribing meets people in the community where they are and links them to social supports. And so this was covered in the New York Times some years ago, and I actually did a TED Talk. And I actually didn't just, sort of talk the talk, I actually walked the walk. And during the pandemic, I ended up reaching out to a local support group organization that's down here in the Southwest US, and created a lot of content, and we sort of ran a weekly kind of support group virtually with a lot of content. And I know the Brian Grant Foundation continues to do some of this work as well, and really sort of connecting patients with each other sort of through this virtual modality. And so our tips for clinicians was really, understand the effects of loneliness, ask about social health, think about those 3 spheres, and be intentional about, cultivating possibly some interventions there. Who can we get as in the friend circle? Who can we get, to be the cheerleader for women, for example? Maybe it's not their husband, maybe it's their, best friend from high school, their sorority sister, their neighbor, their daughter. And screening. So do you sometimes or often feel left out? Do you sometimes feel isolated from others? These are some of the screening questionnaires that are very simple. It takes a minute or two to ask, and then really thinking about social prescribing. So connecting people in their communities, to virtual community groups, virtual exercise classes, outdoor recreation activities, thinking about, psychological interventions if loneliness, is leading to depression, anxiety, are there things like plugging you into a psychologist, and also getting a framework of this wellness strategies every day, creating schedules, putting these sort of, social connection activities on the calendar, so that you will be motivated to go out, finding people in your, sort of life that keep you coming out, making sure that they you sort of check in on you and are going to call you out when you don't show up to that exercise class or that, luncheon. I think we want to have people motivate us and really sort of help us, achieve the level best us that can be possibly lived. And I think we propose some of these solutions in this wellness antidote to mental health issues. Really thinking about those first bubbles that I showed you about all the barriers to mental health. Are we able to educate and empower patients, by teaching them these treatable lifestyle choices, like sleep, diet, exercise, mind-body approaches, focusing on, educating also about disease awareness, mental health is part of this, destigmatizing from day one, engaging a multidisciplinary team, and then getting that sort of healthcare back into the community, and, perhaps thinking about who's not being served in all of this. So you guys are already drinking the Kool-Aid. You're on this, webinar, learning about what you can do better. Who's not on here? Who's not coming in for these in-person support groups? There may be people that are more isolated now than they were before the pandemic, and trying to be intentional about recapturing some of those people is what I'm, hoping that we can do even by phone calls. So thinking about that social prescribing, and then eventually hopefully getting the sense that the person living with the disease has self-agency, which can really make a big difference in how they're going to do in the long run. So again, thinking about, how we adapt, we get the diagnosis of Parkinson's, there's a number of things that can be affected. And I think, at the end of the day, if we can have good social support, we can really change sort of how we feel overall. And so, when we look at this balance on quality of life, the things that can drive quality of life down include loneliness, stigma, feeling demoralized from the disease diagnosis. And what types of things can we cultivate to really, balance that out, or trying to, help with self-agency, helping the person living with the disease to feel like they are in control of their lifestyle choices. And social support is a huge part of this. So building in ways that people can get, support groups, group classes, exercising groups, and social prescribing, are all things that we've proposed. And so really, when we're talking about stigma, again, I think, thinking about, sort of empowerment and social support continue to be sort of front and center in targeting many of these things that are, really plaguing people living with Parkinson's. And so mental health issues can be buffered, trauma can be buffered, loneliness can be buffered, stigma can all be buffered by, the social support. So when we think about the trajectory of disease, we're here now, where we may, in the prodromal timeframe, be able to identify who's at risk for getting Parkinson's. We're then diagnosing people here and following them over a number of years, and people have wanted to get a sense of, what does this trajectory look like? What can I expect? How can I prepare? And I think that social support from the get-go is important. So identifying who's lonely, who might have had trauma, for example, who might have existing mental health stuff, even at diagnosis, PTSD, things like that. What are the things that we can plug people in? Is there a religious sort of organization that they would love to kind of reconnect with? Are there folks, in areas, for example, veteran support groups, Parkinson support groups? There's a number of groups that we can try to plug people into, and try to sort of help create a safety net of support, from diagnosis, so that people aren't waiting until later in disease to really engage people who might have been left out of the conversations in their families. And really, these folks are already knowledgeable about all the things that we're dealing with, so that we can make shared decisions together to kind of honor goals of care and support quality of life throughout, the sort of lifespan of a person living with Parkinson. So we sort of wrote this paper and thought about, in the best of cases, with the most resources, what does a good sort of approach to Parkinson's look like in the perfect world? So in my opinion, I think, screening from get-go for mental health issues, screening for things like trauma, if you've had early childhood adversity, if you've had PTSD, things like that, screening for cognitive issues every year, screening for things like vision and hearing, which can change sort of outcomes, screening for fall risk, swallow issues, weight loss, all of these things can portend some safety issues to come. So being proactive about this. And also, down here really is the money. So thinking about, screening for loneliness, screening for what the social support that exists, and pairing people perhaps with a Parkinson's buddy or mentor, support group, helping support their caregivers as well. And then engaging the interdisciplinary team. So it's not just me as the doctor. There's so many other people on the team that can really help with all of this and are instrumental. And then this wellness education. So thinking about how can we help people to choose lifestyle choices, which include social connection, to sort of add on the calendar every day to try to live better. And so we really need to be proactive about this. And so we reimagine that sort of whole health wheel where the patient's in the middle, these sort of lifestyle choices around, and then all the people that may be, instrumental, including support group and community leaders and things, social prescribing down here with the social connection piece here. So I think, are there folks in your lives that may be part of the medicine for you? So it might be, a dietitian, it might be a yoga teacher, it might be an occupational therapist, it might be, a personal trainer. So really thinking about, maybe it's even a faith-based resource. So thinking about all the things and all the people that could touch you to help keep you, well, is really, I think, sort of the expanded sort of ability to think more broadly about social connection. So we had proposed this wellness task force at the Movement Disorder Society a couple years ago, and we're just wrapping this up right now with a paper, hopefully defining some of these lifestyle choices and giving folks some sense of what we're recommending. And really, I think the world is going into a place where we're more and more caring about brain health. And brain health is hugely benefited by social connection. So here you see the EAN, the AN, all of them have these sort of sense of like how to keep your brain, doing well. And really, some of the things I mentioned, things like, hearing impairment, vision impairment, and things, but social connection is a huge, huge piece of this. And so we really need to work, together to help spread that word to anyone who will really hear this. So a couple last resources. So we have the Surgeon General's book, Together, that is a beautiful sort of compilation of some of this data, as well as great stories and anecdotes about his own life, feeling lonely, and why it matters. So Together is something that I highly recommend. And then on the concept of self-agency, Viktor Frankl's work on Man's Search for Meaning, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So I love this book. This is something that I highly recommend. It's quite a short read, but really powerful. And then, I think, with thinking about how to, sort of live better and socially connect, I think the advocacy piece should not be understated. So really so inspired by many of you as patients who are advocates, trying to sort of come forward and use your sort of lived experience and advocate for others who are living with this disease. Highly recommend you looking into this book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, and, think about, perhaps, joining others in this sort of fight to end Parkinson's disease. This is a beautiful sort of sense of volunteerism and social connection to a larger cause. So thank you so much for your time. I think that's sort of the end of my slide deck. So happy to take questions at this point.
What a great presentation. Thank you so much. One question. We are, with COVID, we entered into this virtual world. Is there a difference between virtual connections and in-person connections? Are they, equal, one better than the other? What's your thought?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's some sense that, that we are, still connecting. And I think that some connections better than no connection. So phone calls, virtual videos. I think, we've seen that it has, I know in my own life, been a huge source of, of beautiful connections that we were able to have with my family living in various parts of the US and Canada during the pandemic. So it's certainly better than nothing. But I think that in person is actually, very important. We have, as humans, oxytocin and other chemicals that we release when we're in the room, when we're hugging, when we're, holding somebody's hand or able to touch someone, seeing their faces, in person, looking in their eyes. There's a lot of actual, sort of changes chemically that happen, and we actually resonate sometimes. In the same frequency, weirdly, like, I mean, in mind body spaces and things, when you're in a room breathing together, doing yoga together, meditating together, there's something very special. So I think, we have been able to bring some of these things in groups to people who may not have ever been open to the idea of coming into a yoga studio or a mindfulness space. But I think that, if you can get out and actually see people and meet people, certainly if you're not immunocompromised, I would urge you to kind of get back out. And, if you're having anxiety about being in closed spaces, maybe do it outside, but I think, taking off those masks if you're able to, and really sort of experiencing again the sort of beautiful sort of interactions of smiling faces and touch and hugs is sort of, I think, also, a human need. As far as healthcare, provision, I think that I personally, as a movement doc, have found that virtual visits are helpful for possibly follow-ups. I personally think that new visits are much better done in person because I'm needing to touch people and move people, their bodies, and look for stiffness and rigidity and look at their pull test and stuff. So I think, again, if you're able to go in and meet your clinicians in person, it's actually very helpful and sometimes uncovers things that we may not be able to really assess on a virtual visit.
You. I agree. I think, taking that first step into the virtual world is a way to help get you to meet that community, and then you can take it the step further of actually meeting these people in public. Um, you talked about bespoke health, and then you also talked about the screening for the loneliness. How do you get your physician on board with this? How do you give them this information that this is needed, that this multidisciplinary approach is needed? Um, because it feels like sometimes you go in and you get your 15 minutes and it's not addressed and you don't know how to approach it or how to get your other doctors involved. I
Mm.
know this is a huge question I just asked, but
Yeah.
kind of, yeah, how do you get that bespoke care? And then how do you get them to acknowledge that you need to be screened for this loneliness?
Mhm. Well, I think, proactivity is always key. And I think, patients need to advocate for themselves. I think, we are, as a healthcare system, unfortunately very strapped. We don't have enough clinicians. We don't have enough neurologists or movement disorder docs. And that's not going to change. It may actually get worse. And that's actually discussed in the Ending Parkinson's Disease book. And we're trying to recruit more physicians, into our subspecialty. But this is a growing number of patients with high complex needs and not very many clinicians. It's very under-resourced. So I think, having the onus be put all on the doctor, the MD, the neurologist, in that small visit is probably not going to happen. I think we really need to be engaging the multidisciplinary team. If you have folks that are, support group leader or a physical therapist or someone else that you're working with, maybe bringing it up. They have more time to spend with you one-on-one. An occupational therapist actually can be engaged, or the speech therapist can be engaged to help you use those, muscles for speaking and get out there and talk more, or come up with plans to connect you more. Occupational therapy actually as a specialty, I guess, was created, I heard, for, connecting veterans or people that came back from, wars back into society. So this is part of, their actual historical sort of job description or training. So I think we can, sort of get a little creative with who's in your, sort of universe. I think if you're listening to this talk and you're like, you know what, I am lonely, I don't have any connection in any of those spheres, or, I have it in one sphere. I think be honest about that. I think you can. I don't think your clinician has to screen you for those questions. I told you what, I sometimes or often feel left out. I sometimes or often feel, sort of isolated. I think if you're answering these and you can bring that to even your primary care doctor, or anyone on your healthcare team, that may be able to help you connect with others. And I think, people feel lonely in their loneliness, and loneliness is stigmatized as well. So, just saying it out loud, I'm lonely, I need to, I have no one in my life that I connect with. And is actually, I think, part of the, first step to getting help. And then, engaging with, I don't even know that it has to be a doctor. It could be your neighbors, it could be your son, that you haven't been able to talk to, or is too busy. You think they're just too busy. Like, let's get some, dates on the calendar, or whoever it is. And I think being proactive about this and sort of spreading the word, sometimes people are like, well, I'm not that lonely, but, I'm happy to make some phone calls, on this phone tree to people who may be more lonely. And I think that volunteerism of realizing, in some ways, part of the messaging is that you can actually help others that aren't in the room, that have fallen off the, sort of, uh, uh, you know, um, the grid in some ways. And I actually was talking to some a pastor at like a meeting for it was like some help faith leaders in the African American community, and they actually call it the empty pew syndrome. So, Mr. and Mrs. Smith used to come and sit in this pew, and Mr. Smith got diagnosed with Parkinson's, and Mrs. Smith was bringing him in before the pandemic, and no one's seen them. What happened to them? Maybe they're just struggling by themselves and they don't want to ask for help. Like, maybe we can, can we reach out to them? So I think, being intentional and realizing that this is actually part of the medicine, and actually a vital human need, that's a social determinant of health that I think is not well, unfortunately, talked about even to doctors. Like, we don't go to school and learn about this in med school. So I don't think that we can fault the physicians for not doing this. That said, when we talk about the the sort of larger, sort of multidimensional or holistic approach, with these lifestyle choices, the last Movement to Sort of Society meeting had, actually a series of holistic health lectures, the holistic approach to a newly diagnosed early patient, and then a later, sort of in the disease trajectory patient. These were two lectures, and they actually, shouted out some of the stuff that I just showed you. And so I think we are, as a community, internationally realizing that this is important. How that trickles down to your local neurologist, I think, time will tell. But I think, writing things down that are important, having a very clear message, not asking the doctor to do 50 things that is. If loneliness is the main thing that you want to have talked about, then bring that up at the beginning of the visit and say, there's something I wanted to bring up. I have no one in my life. I'm really lonely and I'm struggling. Can you help me? And that's the sort of, agenda of the visit is important. I think, often we let the doctor kind of control the agenda. We don't bring up these sort of issues until, a hand on the doorway. Oh, by the way. And then they're like, well, why didn't you tell me this, at the beginning? So I think, communication that's, also is also hugely important. I think, how to do that well.
So the next big question is, how do we get health insurance on board? How do we advocate that social prescribing is something that we need, which means helping to cover some of the costs of, fitness classes, art classes, some of these other therapeutic mechanisms that not everybody necessarily has the budget for.
Yeah. I think that's the big picture. That's the big problem, is that our health system is not set up metrics wise to value things that actually prevent downstream consequences. That's the truth. We spend a lot of money, and I mean, I hate to say this, but I will say it. I mean, hospitals make money off of doing procedures and taking care of very sick people. So we have, for-profit, capitalistic, sort of folks that make money off of us getting sick. So, we have to fight as doctors who believe in this. This is why I went into med school, is to help people to live better and not make them sick and make money off of them, right? And we as a society need to care about each other enough to say, I care about my neighbors. This matters. This, now that I know that, my child being on their phone by themselves and not having actual interactions with anyone could be harmful down the road. This isn't just a Parkinson's issue. This is a societal issue that matters, but we are missing this huge, sort of highly impactful, issue, even though our Surgeon General wrote this book and is going around talking about this. So I think, there's a disconnect between where the metrics are, um, and, even palliative care. I mean, does it not make sense that, if I give you a sense that we should be talking to everyone about, not dying in the hospital and not doing aggressive measures, that are sort of costly, that are unnecessary and not, aligned with what the patient wants, that should be obvious that should be a cost saver, but somehow in many metrics, we are unable to really show that. So I think we have to really re-look at how we are measuring outcomes and how to change policy to what people want and what doctors know is important, and not let, unfortunately, everyone who's making money off of things, which are often the folks that are driving medicine in this country, to really make the decisions that matter.
So would you recommend writing letters to our insurance companies or our representatives? I mean, as a group, I mean, if we band together and say this is important to us and our well-being, how do we initiate the change?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just a neurologist, honestly. I'm not a I work at the VA. I'm trying to,
Yeah.
I think for, small, how do we get things, changed in our backyards? I think, intentionally each of us, if each of us goes from this phone call and starts to make a difference in our communities and tells, the 5 people that we care about that this is something that we learned about, I think, that hopefully that will spread. But I think that, what I'm pushing for is that loneliness, 1 minute loneliness screen should be embedded in, an electronic health record asked by somebody who matters, because it shouldn't just be, the clerk who's taking your copay that asks you if you're lonely. Like, they don't care.
Yeah.
It has to be asked by a physician. And that, then we have ways to, sort of really plug people in that are in real time that they see, are actually beneficial, and that it doesn't help to say you're lonely and then not do anything about it. Like,
Mm.
it should be like
Yeah.
here's a pamphlet, here's 5 things, pick one, let's find out if, and I try to do that. I literally will be like, here's your homework this week, Mr. Smith, I want you to call your so and so, like, who's the most important person to you. Okay, let's try to call them once a week and then report back to me, or go, what's a cool class that you want to do, that is available. Well, I want you, to go out, put that on your calendar, and then I want you to report back to me. So, like, I have to actually have, a vested interest in hearing that back, and really caring about, the answer to these questions, not just about screening.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to shift a little bit. Feel so I've moved many times as an adult, and I feel like each time I have to set up a new community and make friends. And I feel like we need a book on how to make friends as an adult. And with Parkinson's, it's even more of a challenge. One of the things I hear in my support groups is their friends are helpful and invite them out, but in certain situations, it can be overwhelming because of the noise or overstimulus, or somebody just asked that entering a new social situation. How do we address the needs of the person with Parkinson's to our friends and with 2 new people? Should you just be upfront? You know, don't always want to seem like I'm complaining, but it's, how do we get them to recognize kind of our needs and address this anxiety into new social situations?
So I think taking baby steps, I think, not trying to do, like anything else, when you're trying to make a change in your life, trying to go from, being effectively, completely isolated, not having any folks, and then, like, trying to go to a nightclub and, think, or a bowling alley, and think that you're going to have a great old time having, you really have to take baby steps. And I know with my own parents, who are aging in Canada, just trying to get them out again, after the pandemic, after they had been, sort of really the catastrophizing sort of media campaigns of, like, you have to stay home. And they just got used to, this life, of really not interacting very much. It was literally baby steps. Why don't you try to go to the grocery store? Maybe go to, go for a walk and, sit in a park if something's available, and, perhaps smile at, a person while you're walking. Maybe it's not a conversation. Maybe it's a smile. Maybe it's, you know, trying to, again, baby steps. So I think, if something seems hugely like there's no way that that could ever happen, or I think people sort of take the last time that something bad happened, which may be, a one time in 100 that something bad happened, right? And then they catastrophize, like, and they assume that every day from that moment, every day is going to be bad. And it's like, actually, it was only 1%. So I think, there are ways also with a psychologist, or a therapist, physical, OT, speech. Again, these folks can, make plans, and goals that are very bite-sized and check in with you and kind of really talk about the psychology of it, because there's sort of this mental processing sometimes where we assume because something happened that it's going to define now the rest of, how it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can kind of really test our thoughts. Does that make sense? Okay, actually, no.
Mm-hmm.
And by taking these baby steps and a small exposure, right? So, okay, I did okay, sitting in that coffee shop, on a Sunday morning at 6 a.m. when there was hardly anyone there. Maybe I come in at 7 a.m. and then, it gets busier. I switch the time to a slightly busier time. So I think, again, I think having these sort of bite-sized pieces, just like with exercise. You're not going to make a huge, you're not going to run the New York Marathon tomorrow if you're largely sitting on your couch now, but like, can you walk, 10 meters? Can you, start, with these small goals and kind of gear up? And I think being honest is reasonable. Again, I think most people are very worried about what everybody else is thinking about them. And actually, most of the time, people don't care. Nobody's even noticing you. Like, that's just the honest truth. I mean, most people are more worried about themselves than like, oh, why is this person tremoring? Or, so I think there's just so
Mm-hmm.
many, like, oh, what if I walk in this restaurant and people see me and start thinking these 5 things? Actually, the lived experience is that most people are on their phones and kind of zoned out.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really too bothered about any of this. So. But the psyche is that we kind of talk ourselves
Yeah.
out of doing things because of this. Just, I think, that's human nature.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap up. So, Dr. Subramanian, I would like to thank you so much for providing all of this information. I mean, just proving, I think, what everybody has been feeling, but actually being able to put into words, into graphs, into wonderful graphics for us. I'd like to just end by letting everybody else know that social prescription is one of the pillars that the Brian Grant Foundation is founded on. We really feel that, nutrition, exercise, mental well-being is, part of all of our being able to live active and well lives. I want to just give a couple tips. We're going into social situations, having a business card with your name that says, I'm Amy LaValle, I have Parkinson's, if you'd like to learn more information, and have a link to our website or something. So then that way you don't have to have the conversation right there, but the person can take the information with them and understand kind of your needs. We have a journaling club tonight. Dr. Subramanian was just talking about how important journaling is. We have a group of people, we get together, we have a prompt, we write, we share. So it is social, it is getting that skill of writing and letting those emotions out, and it is a wonderful group. And that is tonight at 5 o'clock Pacific time. We also have our weekly breath by breath guided by Kimberly, where we do a discussion on a reflection question, and she walks us through a meditation. It is a wonderful group of people, and that is on Tuesdays at 11:30 Pacific time as well. And like she said, let's just put things on the calendars, have some friends keep you accountable, and libraries have wonderful resources out there for you as well. So everybody, I want to thank you for tuning in today. I hope you all take an opportunity to call each other, check on each other, and go do something social. Dr. Subramanian, thank you again for joining us, and hope everybody has a wonderful fall.